DeBary, Florida, presents itself to the world as a sanctuary of suburban calm. Situated in Volusia County along the northern shores of the St. Johns River, the city is characterized by its canopy of ancient oaks hanging Spanish moss and the rhythmic quiet of bedroom community life. It is a place where residents prioritize safety and stability, a landscape of manicured lawns and single-story homes that promise a retreat from the chaotic pulse of larger metropolitan centers like Orlando to the south. In November 2018, the residence on Alicante Road stood as a testament to this ideal. It was a structure that blended seamlessly into the neighborhood, projecting an image of orderly domesticity and middle-class success. Inside, the household was led by Gail Cleavenger, a woman whose life was defined by professional precision and maternal devotion. Gail Cleavenger was 46 years old, a woman of intellect and distinct capability. By trade, she was an architect and designer, a profession that requires a rigorous adherence to structure, logic, and long-term planning. Her career was not merely a job, but a reflection of her personality. She built things to last, understanding that the integrity of any creation relies on the strength of its foundation. Her colleagues and friends recognized her as a tireless worker, someone who balanced the demanding specifications of architectural design with the equally demanding role of a single mother. Her world revolved around her son, Gregory Ramos. She was the primary provider, the disciplinarian, and the guiding force in his life. Gail was known to be a dedicated mother, the kind who was deeply involved in her child's development, while holding him to standards she believed were necessary for his survival and success in a competitive world. She did not view her role as a passive observer of her son's adolescence, but as the active manager of his potential. Gregory Ramos, at 15 years old, appeared to be the tangible result of Gail's dedicated parenting. To the community of DeBary and the faculty at University High School, Gregory was the antithesis of the troubled teen narrative often associated with violent crime. He was intelligent, articulate, and outwardly respectful of authority. He did not have a history of violent outbursts or a rap sheet of petty crimes. Instead, Gregory had cultivated a persona that commanded respect and trust from adults. He was a promising member of the Orange City Police Explorers, a program designed for youths interested in pursuing careers in law enforcement. This was the defining element of his identity outside the home. The Police Explorers program is not a casual extracurricular club. It is a paramilitary-style organization that trains young men and women in the procedures, ethics, and tactics of police work. Gregory wore the uniform. He participated in ride-alongs. He studied criminal law, crime scene preservation, and the mechanics of investigation. He was immersed in the culture of the badge, learning how officers think, how they analyze behavior, and how they secure a scene. Those who knew him in this capacity saw a future deputy or detective, a young man who was eager to serve and protect. He was surrounded by mentors in law enforcement who viewed him as one of their own in training. This affiliation provided Gregory with a veneer of absolute reliability. In the eyes of his neighbors, a boy who spends his free time training with the police is the last person one would suspect of harboring lethal intent. The relationship between Gail and Gregory was intense. He forged in the dynamic of a single-parent household where expectations often run high. Gail wanted Gregory to excel. She pushed him academically, believing that his intelligence was a gift that should not be squandered. However, by the autumn of 2018, the pressure within the home had begun to rise. The friction point was academic performance. For a woman who made her living through the exactitude of architecture, a lack of effort in school was unacceptable. It was not a matter of ability. Gail knew her son was capable. It was a matter of discipline. The irony of the conflict that brewed in early November was distinct. Gregory was struggling in his architecture class, the very discipline his mother had mastered. He had let his grade slip to a D. In the calculus of the Cleavenger household, a D was not merely a poor mark. It was a symptom of a broader failure of character and effort. It signified a lack of attention to detail, a trait fatal in architecture and unacceptable to Gail. She did not take a passive approach to this news. She demanded accountability. She expected her son to correct the course, to apply the same discipline to his studies that he applied to his police training. On the afternoon of November 1, 2018, the normality of the Ramos routine began to fracture under this weight, though the cracks were invisible to the outside world. But Gregory returned home to the inevitable confrontation regarding his report card. The house on Alicante Road, usually a place of quiet refuge, became the setting for a sharp domestic dispute. Gail confronted Gregory about his performance. She was firm, likely leveraging the privileges he enjoyed, including his electronics and his freedom, against his academic failure. This was standard parenting in millions of homes, a mother drawing a line in the sand and demanding that her child live up to his potential. The argument that ensued was the catalyst for the tragedy, yet it began as a mundane interaction common to the suburban experience. There were no drugs fueling the dispute, no history of physical abuse, no external gang influences breaching the front door. The tension was entirely intimate and contained. It was a clash of wills between a mother who refused to accept mediocrity and a son who felt the walls of expectation closing in on him. Gregory, the boy trained to remain calm under pressure in simulated police scenarios, found himself seething with a very real and unmanaged rage in the safety of his own kitchen. As the evening of November 1st transitioned into the early morning hours of November 2nd, the facade of the happy police explorer and the dedicated architect remained intact to the rest of DeBary. The neighbors saw only a dark house. They heard no gunshots, for there was no gun. They saw no police cars arriving to quell a disturbance. The silence of the street remained unbroken. Inside, however, the psychological break had occurred. The architectural stability of the family unit had been compromised. Gregory Ramos, the boy who fantasized about upholding the law, was essentially ceasing to exist, replaced by a cold, calculating figure who would soon apply his forensic knowledge to a crime scene of his own making. The stage was set not by a chaotic intruder, but by the simmering resentment of a 15-year-old boy who decided that the removal of the disciplinarian was the only solution to his grievance. The quiet life in DeBary was about to be shattered, not from the outside, but from the very heart of the home itself. The evening of Thursday, November 1st, 2018, settled over DeBary, Florida, with the deceptive calm of a typical suburban autumn. The humidity had broken slightly, leaving the air crisp. But inside the single-story home on the quiet cul-de-sac, the atmosphere was pressurized. The residence, usually a sanctuary of middle-class stability, had transformed into a vessel of mounting tension. The catalyst for this shift was not a catastrophic external event, but a digital notification, a single letter grade that would dismantle the future of the Cleavenger Ramos family. Gregory Ramos, 15 years old and a student at University High School, had returned home carrying the weight of a secret that could not be kept. He was known to his peers and teachers as an intelligent, engaged young man. He was a member of the Police Explorers, a youth program affiliated with law enforcement that emphasized discipline, order, and civic duty. This affiliation suggested a respect for hierarchy and rules, a desire to align himself with the structures of authority. Yet, the grade he had received in his architecture class stood in stark contradiction to this carefully cultivated image of excellence. It was a D. For many teenagers, a poor grade in an elective course might result in a brief reprimand or a temporary grounding. However, the dynamic within the Ramos household was predicated on high achievement. Gail Cleavenger, 46, was a mother who invested deeply in her son's success. She was an architect of his future as much as he was a student of the discipline. She viewed academic performance not merely as a measure of intelligence, but as a reflection of character and discipline. A failing or near-failing grade was not just a stumbling block. It was perceived as a dereliction of duty. The timing of this revelation was critical. Danny Cleavenger, Gregory's stepfather and a stabilizing presence in the home, was away on a business trip. His absence left a vacuum in the domestic dynamic. Often, a third party can serve as a buffer in parent-child disputes, diffusing intensity or offering a path to de-escalation. Without him, the home contained only the mother and the son, locking them into a binary confrontation from which neither would retreat. The isolation of the house, set back in a neighborhood where privacy was respected, meant that the rising temperature of their interaction went unobserved by the outside world. When the subject of the architecture grade was broached, the reaction was immediate. Gail did not brush it off. The confrontation that ensued was not a chaotic shouting match filled with physical violence, but rather a sharp, piercing dismantling of Gregory's current standing. She demanded accountability. The D represented a lack of effort, a lack of focus, and a disrespect for the opportunities provided to him. As a mother, she exercised her prerogative to discipline, laying down consequences that were standard for the situation, but felt draconian to the 15-year-old. Privileges were revoked. Electronics, the lifeline of modern adolescent social interaction, were to be taken away. The car, a symbol of his emerging independence, was off limits. The dialogue, while heated, remained within the bounds of a strict parenting moment, yet for Gregory, the psychological impact was disproportionate. He did not view this as a course correction, and he viewed it as a total annihilation of his autonomy. The criticism leveled at him regarding the architecture class struck a specific nerve. Architecture is a discipline of precision, planning, and structural integrity. Failing at it implied a fundamental flaw in his ability to construct his own life. The argument reached its peak in the early evening. Gail, firm in her decision and believing she was setting her son back on the path to success, eventually withdrew from the conflict. She retreated to her bedroom, likely believing the matter was settled. The punishment had been levied, the disappointment expressed, and the next day would bring a chance for improvement. She expected sulking. She expected teenage moodiness. She did not anticipate that the conversation had not ended, but had merely moved entirely inside her son's mind. Gregory retreated to his room. The door closed, creating a physical barrier between the mother and son, but the mental connection remained severed and bleeding. In the solitude of his bedroom, the resentment began to curdle. This was the incubation period. For hours, while the rest of DeBary wound down for the night, turning off porch lights and locking doors, Gregory sat with his failure. The D grade became a fixated point of rage. It was the symbol of an unpleasable authority. The narrative Gregory constructed in those hours was not one of remorse or determination to study harder, or it was a narrative of victimization and cold logic. He began to weigh the consequences of his current reality against a horrific alternative. In his mind, the issue was not the grade, but the source of the judgment. The presence of his mother became the obstacle to his freedom. The discipline she enforced was not seen as love, but as containment. He later recounted the thought process that dominated this period. It was not a sudden snap of psychosis, but a simmering, a linear progression of dark rationality. He felt backed into a corner by the expectations placed upon him. The police explorer, trained to observe and react, began to treat his home as a tactical scenario. The bad grade was the threat to his status. His mother was the enforcer of that threat. To remove the threat, he concluded he had to remove the enforcer. As the clock ticked past 10 p.m., the house grew silent. Gail had gone to bed, assuming the safety of her own home. She had no reason to barricade her door. The argument over the architecture class, in her mind, was a mundane element of raising a teenager, unpleasant but necessary. She likely went to sleep thinking about the logistics of the next day, perhaps planning to call Danny to update him, or thinking of ways to help Gregory bring his grade up. She was unaware that just down the hall, the architecture of a murder was being drafted. Gregory remained awake, but the simmering resentment had transitioned into a cold resolve. He moved past the emotional heat of the argument and entered a state of dissociation. He later described the feeling as an inevitability. The sheer duration of this contemplation is significant. This was not a crime of passion committed in the heat of a shouting match. The shouting had stopped hours ago. This was a crime of brooding. He sat in his room surrounded by the artifacts of his life, his school books, his uniforms, on the very drafting assignments that had caused the dispute, and let the idea of matricide take root. He thought about the logistics. He considered the fact that his father was away. It was a window of opportunity that would not remain open indefinitely. If he were to act, it had to be now. The presence of the D grade felt like a permanent stain that could only be washed away by a total reset of his circumstances. In the warped logic of the late hour, killing his mother appeared to him as a pragmatic solution to the problem of parental control. The silence of the house became amplified. Every creak of the settling foundation, every hum of the refrigerator marked the passing of time. Midnight approached. The transition from November 1st to November 2nd was indistinguishable in the dark, yet it marked the crossing of a threshold. He was no longer just a student with a bad grade. He was a predator in waiting. He eventually emerged from his room. The house was dark. He moved through the familiar hallways, the geography of his childhood home, now a crime scene in potentiality. He checked the environment. He ensured there were no interruptions. The resentment regarding the architecture class had metastasized into a total rejection of the life his mother had built for him. He did not see Gail Cleavenger, the woman who raised him. He saw only the barrier to his will. The specific detail of the architecture grade is haunting because it underscores the disconnect between performance and reality. Gregory was failing to build structures on paper, yet he was meticulously constructing a plan to dismantle a life in reality. The irony was likely lost on him in those dark hours. He was focused only on the immediate objective. The pressure that had built up over the course of the afternoon and evening had nowhere to go. It did not dissipate with sleep. It did not resolve with tears. It hardened. He stood outside her bedroom door. The decision had been made. The simmering was over. The boiling point had been reached, not with a scream, but with a silent, deadly intent. The mundane trigger of a high school report card had set in motion a sequence of events that was entirely disproportionate to the cause. The academic failure was the spark, but the fuel was a deep-seated, hidden capacity for violence that no one, least of all Gail, had suspected. He entered the room. The air was still. The build-up was complete. The hours of contemplating the D, the argument, the punishment, and the resentment had distilled into a singular, horrific action plan. The time for architectural drafting was over. The time for destruction had begun. Sequence of events that would irrevocably shatter the suburban quiet of the family home. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. November 2nd, 2018 had begun in silence, but it would not remain that way. Inside the master bedroom, Gail Cleavenger was asleep, resting before an early shift at her work, unaware that the argument from hours prior had not resolved itself in her son's mind, but had instead metastasized into a lethal plan. Gregory Ramos opened the door. He moved with a calculated stillness that belied his age. There was no hesitation in his step, no trembling in his hands. He did not turn on the lights. The room was illuminated only by the faint ambient glow of streetlights filtering through the blinds, casting long, indistinct shadows across the furniture. He approached the bed where his mother lay. In later accounts provided to investigators, the teenager described this moment devoid of emotional conflict. He was not a terrified child acting out of a sudden hot flash of rage. He was executing a decision he had solidified minutes earlier. He climbed onto the bed. The mattress shifted under his weight, but the movement was controlled. He positioned himself directly over his sleeping mother. Before she could register his presence, before she could wake to ask what he was doing or why he was there, he reached out. His hands, the same hands that had failed to produce the architecture drawings up to standard for his class, closed around her throat. The attack began in silence but quickly descended into a chaotic physical struggle. Strangulation is rarely the swift, silent event depicted in fiction. It is a brutal, intimate, and prolonged physical exertion. As his grip tightened, the biological reality of the assault took over. The airway was compressed, and the blood flow through the carotid arteries was restricted. Gail Cleavenger woke into a nightmare. Her body's survival instincts activated immediately. She began to fight. Ramos would later detail this struggle to detectives with a chilling degree of clinical detachment. He described how his mother attempted to defend herself. In the darkness, her hands flew up, clawing at his face and arms, desperate to break the hold that was cutting off her oxygen. She managed to inflict damage. Deep scratches would later be documented on Ramos's face, physical evidence of her final, desperate attempt to survive her own child. But Ramos did not recoil. He did not let go. He adjusted his leverage, using his body weight to pin her down, overriding her defensive thrashing with superior position and youthful strength. The duration of the event stands as the most disturbing aspect of the teenager's confession. Ramos told investigators that the process took approximately 30 minutes. While forensic pathology suggests that unconsciousness from a properly applied chokehold can occur in seconds and death within minutes, the discrepancy suggests a prolonged, agonizing sequence of struggle, recovery, and reapplication of force. It implies that the act was not a continuous, unbroken compression, but a sustained battle where the victim may have fought for air repeatedly, only to be suppressed again. For 30 minutes, the two existed in a horrific vacuum of time. The house remained silent to the outside world. No neighbors heard the struggle. The walls of the DeBary home contained the violence completely. Ramos described looking into his mother's eyes as he strangled her. He noted the changes in her expression, the terror that gave way to the physiological shutdowns of the brain. And he did not look away. He maintained his grip, fueled by a cold internal logic that saw her death as the only resolution to the conflict over his grades. During this half hour, the physical exertion required from Ramos was immense. Strangulation requires significant sustained force. Muscles fatigue, adrenaline spikes and crashes. Yet he persisted. He later explained that there were moments where he thought she might be dead, only to feel her move or attempt to breathe, she prompting him to tighten his grip once more. This cyclical nature of the violence, the false stops, and the renewed attacks stretched the timeline out, distorting the perception of minutes into an eternity for the victim. The psychology of the attacker during this window was devoid of panic. He was not acting in a frenzy where he blacked out and woke up to find a body. He was present. He was aware. He was monitoring the effectiveness of his actions. He was judging the level of life remaining in his mother. This was the cold mindset detectives would later note with disturbia. It was a transactional interaction to him, the removal of an obstacle. The D grade had threatened his future privileges and standing. The argument had threatened his autonomy. The murder was the assertion of ultimate control. As the minutes dragged on, Gail's resistance faded. The lack of oxygen to the brain, or cerebral hypoxia, began to cause irreversible damage. The frantic clawing at his face slowed and then ceased. The thrashing of her legs against the mattress stopped. The sounds of the struggle, the gasps, the movements of the bed frame were replaced by the heavy breathing of the teenager. Even after she stopped moving, Ramos did not immediately release her. He wanted to be certain. He waited, maintaining the pressure, ensuring that the loop of the struggle was truly closed. On the 30-minute estimate he provided likely encompasses this final phase. The holding of the lifeless body to ensure resurrection was impossible. He checked her pulse. He checked for breath. He applied the clinical scrutiny of a biological examination to the woman who had raised him. When he finally pulled his hands away, the silence that returned to the room was absolute. It was no longer the peaceful silence of a sleeping household, but the heavy, oppressive stillness of a crime scene. Ramos sat back. He was physically exhausted, his arms aching from the strain, his face stinging from the fresh scratches Gally had inflicted. He did not break down in tears. He did not scream for help. He did not dial 911 in a moment of instant regret to try and resuscitate her. Instead, he sat there and processed the reality of the situation with the same cold rationality that had led him into the room. He verified that she was dead. He looked at the body. He assessed his own injuries. And he realized that the scratches on his face were a liability. They were evidence. He stood up from the bed. The adrenaline was beginning to level off, replaced by a pragmatic need to manage the scene. The murder was complete. The grade problem was theoretically solved, but it had been replaced by a body problem. His mind immediately shifted gears from killer to cover-up artist. He did not see a mother. He saw an object that needed to be removed. He exited the bedroom, closing the door on the carnage he had just wrought. He walked through the dark hallway, moving through the house that was now solely his domain. He needed supplies. He needed assistance. The plan for the burglary cover-up, which had perhaps been a vague notion before the attack, now had to be operationalized. He went to the garage. He gathered a wheelbarrow. He found a tarp. These were ordinary household items, tools for gardening and maintenance, now repurposed for disposal. He moved with efficiency. He brought the wheelbarrow back towards the bedroom, preparing for the logistics of transport. But he realized he could not do it alone. The physical task of moving a body, staging a scene, and digging a grave was too much for one person to execute perfectly before sunrise. He needed help. He needed leverage. He returned to his phone. At 12:40 a.m., roughly 40 minutes after he had entered his mother's room, Gregory Ramos made the first outgoing communication. He did not call the police. He called his friends, Dylan Teglerek and Brian Porras. He needed them to come over. He didn't tell them it was an emergency involving an accident. He was direct about the necessity of their presence, though the full grim reality awaited them upon arrival. He waited for them in the driveway, the cool November air settling around him. The house behind him was dark. Inside, Gail Cleavenger lay dead in her bed, the victim of a 30-minute siege by her own son. Ramos stood in the driveway, composing himself, preparing the narrative he would feed his friends, and later the police. The violence of the act was over. The cold, calculated work of the cover-up was just beginning. The arrival of Dylan Teglerek and Brian Porras at the family home on Alicante Road marked the transition from a solitary act of violence to a conspiratorial effort to conceal it. The two 17-year-olds, summoned by Gregory Ramos in the dead of night, I stepped into a residence that had transformed from a suburban sanctuary into a crime scene. Ramos met them not with panic, but with the calculated demeanor of someone who had already formulated a plan. He led them to the master bedroom where Gail Cleavenger lay lifeless. The reality of the situation was visual and undeniable. Ramos explained that he had killed his mother and now required their assistance to dispose of the body and alter the scene to mislead authorities. The dynamic was clear. Ramos was the architect of the event, and he needed manual labor to execute the cleanup. The trio began the logistical process of removing Gail from the home she had worked to maintain. They moved her body from the bedroom, navigating the hallways of the house in silence, eventually loading her into the cargo area of her own vehicle, a maroon minivan. This specific choice of transport was pragmatic. It was the vehicle most readily available and capable of concealing the cargo without drawing attention in the quiet residential neighborhood. Ramos took the wheel. The destination was not chosen at random. They drove to a remote location known to them, a spot behind the River City Church on High Banks Road. This area, often used by the teenagers as a hangout spot for bonfires and late-night gatherings, offered the seclusion required for their task. Once they arrived at the church grounds, the labor began. The ground was Florida soil, sandy and root-filled, and the darkness of the early morning hours provided the only cover they had. They selected an existing fire pit as the burial site. This was a strategic decision intended to mask the disturbance of the earth. By burying the body beneath a location where ground was naturally overturned and covered in ash and debris, they hoped to deflect scrutiny if anyone were to glance at the area. And the physical exertion of digging a grave large enough to conceal an adult woman took time. The boys worked in the shadows, the silence of the night broken only by the sound of shovels hitting the dirt. Once the depth was deemed sufficient, they placed Gail Cleavenger into the earth and filled the hole, carefully replacing the fire pit debris over the fresh mound to restore the appearance of a dormant campsite. With the body hidden, the focus shifted to the narrative they intended to sell to the police. The group returned to the house on Alicante Road to stage the scene of a home invasion. The objective was to create a visual story that explained Gail's disappearance and the state of the house without pointing toward her son. They needed to simulate a burglary gone wrong. This required a violent entry and the theft of valuable goods. Ramos and his friends selected specific items that a typical thief would target: a PlayStation 4 console, a computer tower, a rifle, and other miscellaneous electronics. These items were not discarded, but were given to Teglerek and Porus to hold, creating a physical separation between the stolen goods and the victim. The staging of the entry point was the final critical detail. They chose a side door leading into the garage. To simulate a forced entry, the door needed to show signs of impact. The boys kicked the door, fracturing the frame and damaging the lock mechanism. However, in the haste and adrenaline of the cover-up, the physics of the kick were overlooked, a detail that would later be analyzed by forensic experts. They ensured the house looked ransacked, drawers pulled open, and items scattered, mimicking the chaotic search of an intruder looking for cash or jewelry. By the time they finished, the sun was approaching the horizon. The house was empty of Gail Cleavenger, the stolen items were with the accomplices, and the scene was set. The plan required Ramos to maintain a facade of normalcy. Despite having strangled his mother and buried her body hours prior, he prepared for a regular Friday at school. He attended University High School that morning, sitting in classrooms, walking the hallways, and interacting with peers and teachers. This period of normalcy was an essential component of the alibi. It had established a timeline where he was accounted for, creating a gap during which the burglary could have theoretically occurred. While he was in class, his mother was missing, buried under a fire pit, and his friends were concealing the evidence of the theft. The psychological compartmentalization required to function in a high school environment mere hours after matricide was significant. As the school day concluded, the second act of the performance began. Ramos returned to the Alicante Road home in the afternoon. He entered the house, walking past the staged damage and the emptiness of the rooms. He needed to be the one to discover the crime. He needed to be the victim. At approximately 3:52 p.m., Gregory Ramos dialed 911. The call was the official commencement of the investigation. When the dispatcher answered, Ramos's voice was breathless, pitched to convey shock and rising panic. He reported that he had just come home from school and found his house completely ransacked. He stated that his mother was missing and, crucially, that her van was still running in the driveway. This detail was added to suggest she had been interrupted in the middle of a routine action, perhaps loading the car or arriving home, when the intruders struck. "I just got home from school and my house is trashed," Ramos told the operator. He described the scene he had helped create. "The door is kicked in. My mom's not here. Her car is running in the driveway." He moved through the house while on the phone, describing the disarray to the dispatcher. He mentioned the missing electronics, listing the computer and the gaming console, reinforcing the burglary narrative. He emphasized that his mother would never leave the house in such a state or leave her vehicle running. The performance was designed to urgency. He was a 15-year-old boy, alone, and discovering that his world had been violated by unknown criminals. Volusia County Sheriff's deputies responded to the call rapidly. Uniformed officers arrived at the residence to secure the scene. They found Ramos waiting, playing the part of the distraught son. As deputies swept the house to ensure no intruders were still present, they noted the details Ramos had reported: the open drawers, the missing items, the damaged door. However, the initial walkthrough by law enforcement is trained to look for inconsistencies, and the scene at Alicante Road presented subtle anomalies from the outset. The running van was a theatrical touch, but it raised immediate questions about the timeline. If the burglary had happened during the school day, why was the van running for hours? If it had just happened, where were the perpetrators? The damage to the door also drew the attention of the seasoned investigators. In many staged burglaries, the perpetrators kick the door from the inside to break it out, or the damage does not align with the necessary force required to breach a deadbolt from the exterior. While these observations were not immediately voiced as accusations, they were filed away as investigators began to cordon off the home with yellow tape. Ramos remained at the scene, the central witness. Detectives arrived to take his statement. He recounted the day's events. He went to school. He came home. He found the house this way. He provided a list of the missing items. He expressed deep concern for his mother's safety, suggesting she might have been abducted by the thieves. The police began a missing person investigation in tandem with the burglary inquiry. They canvassed the neighborhood, asking neighbors if they had seen suspicious vehicles or heard noises during the day. Simultaneously, the investigation turned toward the friends. The police look at the close circle of a family when a member goes missing, and Ramos's known associates were Cheglarek and Porras. The boys had the stolen items in their possession, a massive liability that was ticking toward discovery. Ramos had assumed that the burglary narrative would hold, that the police would chase the phantom intruders and the missing electronics, focusing on external threats rather than the people standing in the driveway. As the sun set on Friday, November 2nd, the search for Gail Cleavenger intensified. A helicopter was deployed, its searchlight sweeping the surrounding woods and neighborhoods. K-9 units were brought in to track scents. The community began to stir with worry, unaware that the object of the search lay beneath a fire pit miles away. Ramos stood amidst the activity, the grieving son surrounded by first responders. He accepted the condolences and the support, answering questions and maintaining the fiction. However, the physical evidence was static, and the digital evidence was beginning to accumulate. Investigators looked at the door. They looked at the lack of tire tracks or signs of forced entry on the exterior that matched the violence of the interior. They noted that nothing of value seemed to be missing other than the specific electronics a teenager would value. The jewelry was left. The silverware was untouched. The randomness of a real burglary was missing. The scene felt curated. The scrutiny soon turned to Ramos's digital footprint and his communications. The timeline he provided, school, then home, was rigid, but the gaps in the night before were opaque. Police began to interview his friends, Dylan Teglerek and Brian Porras, separately. This is a standard procedure to verify alibis, but in a conspiracy involving teenagers, it is often the breaking point. The pressure of a homicide investigation is immense, and the reality of potential charges for accessory to murder began to weigh on the accomplices. Back at the house, the burglarized home was being processed by crime scene technicians. They dusted for fingerprints, looking for the unknown assailants. They found plenty of prints belonging to Ramos and his friends, expected given they lived there or visited. But the absence of unknown prints was telling. The scene was too clean in some ways and too messy in others. The 911 call, the cornerstone of Ramos's defense, was now being analyzed not just for information, but for cadence and sincerity. The detectives noted that while Ramos sounded panicked, his narrative was incredibly specific about the running car and the kick door, ensuring these details were recorded immediately. The investigation rapidly pivoted from a search for strangers to a focus on the inner circle. The burial at the fire pit was meant to be permanent, but the soil was fresh. And the secret was shared among 3 impulsive adolescents. The cover-up, designed to last forever, was fraying within hours of the first police radio call. The perfect crime was colliding with the procedural diligence of a homicide investigation. The leverage Ramos thought he had secured by involving his friends was about to become the very mechanism of his undoing. The silence of the fire pit at River City Church would not last the weekend. The investigation at the Cleavenger residence on Alicante Road began with the standard protocols for a burglary in progress, but the atmosphere shifted almost immediately upon the arrival of the Volusia County Sheriff's deputies. The scene presented to law enforcement was chaotic, yet the chaos felt manufactured. A van was idling in the driveway, its engine humming a discordant note in the quiet DeBary afternoon. The front door stood ajar, apparently kicked in, and inside, the house had been tossed, drawers were pulled out, electronics were missing, and the homeowner, Gail Cleavenger, was nowhere to be found. Gregory Ramos, 15 years old and standing in the driveway, presented himself as the panicked son who had returned from school to find his home violated and his mother missing. However, the first responding deputies, and subsequently the detectives from the major case unit, noted immediate discrepancies between Ramos's narrative and the physical evidence. The kicked-in door became the first silent witness against him. In genuine break-ins, the damage to a doorframe typically aligns with the direction of force. Here, the splintering and debris patterns suggested the force might not have been applied with the frantic, violent urgency of a stranger trying to gain quick access. It looked theatrical, a caricature of a crime scene, rather than the aftermath of one. More pressing were the marks on Gregory Ramos himself. As he recounted his timeline, school, returning home, finding the scene, detectives observed fresh, angry scratches on his face. These were not the accidental abrasions of a teenager engaged in sports or yard work. They were distinctive, linear marks consistent with fingernails raking across skin in a defensive struggle. When asked about them, Ramos offered vague, dismissive explanations that failed to align with the severity of the wounds. To a seasoned investigator, those marks screamed of close-quarters combat, of physical intimacy that contradicted the story of a boy arriving home to an empty house. While crime scene investigators processed the home, cataloging the missing items, a PlayStation 4, a computer tower, a rifle, and other electronics, detectives turned their attention to Ramos's digital footprint and social circle. The investigation quickly identified 2 close friends, Dylan Teglerek and Brian Porras, both 17 years old. If this was a staged event, it was unlikely a 15-year-old acted entirely alone in the disposal of evidence and a body, all while attending school. The police located Teglerek and Porras relatively quickly, and the burglary theory began to disintegrate. The friends were separated and questioned. This is a standard tactical maneuver designed to exploit the prisoner's dilemma. Without the ability to coordinate their lies in real time, co-conspirators often fracture under pressure. Arxaglaric and Porus were not hardened career criminals. They were high school students caught in a gravity well of violence they had helped facilitate but not committed. The detectives pressed them on the stolen items. In a true burglary, goods are fenced or pawned immediately for cash. Here, the items were simply missing. Under the weight of interrogation, the facade crumbled. One of the friends cracked, unable to sustain the lie of the random home invasion. But he revealed that the stolen electronics were not sold, but were hidden. He directed the deputies to a secluded spot where the PlayStation, the computer, and the rifle had been stashed. The recovery of these items was the final nail in the coffin for the burglary narrative. There was no gang of thieves. There was no stranger danger. There was only the trio of teenagers and a distinct, sinister plan. With the recovery of the property and the statements from the accomplices implicating Ramos in a homicide, the focus shifted entirely to the interrogation of the son. Gregory Ramos was brought into the interrogation room at the sheriff's office. The environment was sterile, designed to strip away the comforts of the outside world and focus the mind on the truth. Initially, Ramos adhered to his script. He was the grieving son, the victim of a terrible coincidence. He maintained his composure, speaking with an articulation and calmness that unnerved the investigators. He was not hysterical. He was calculating. The detectives, however, held the cards. They slowly introduced the evidence they had gathered. They pointed out the impossibility of the door damage. They brought up the recovered electronics, dismantling the profit motive. Finally, they confronted him with the statements from Teglarek and Porus. The realization that his friends had turned on him, that his carefully constructed stage had collapsed, caused a shift in Ramos's demeanor. The denial ceased, but it was not replaced by tears or panic. Instead, a chilling flat effect took over. Ramos began to confess. The transition from feigned ignorance to detailed admission was abrupt. He waived his rights and began to narrate the events of the previous night with the clinical detachment of a medical examiner discussing a stranger. When he explained that the conflict had initiated over a grade, a D in his architecture class. This academic failure had sparked an argument with his mother, Gail Cleavenger, late on the evening of November 1st. The argument had escalated. Ramos described going into his mother's room after midnight. He did not describe a moment of blind, red-hot rage, but rather a sustained, determined effort to end her life. He told the detectives that he began to strangle her. The details he provided were harrowing in their specificity. He recounted how his mother fought back, how she scratched at his face, explaining the marks the detectives had noted hours earlier. He described the mechanics of the struggle on the bed. The most disturbing aspect of the confession was Ramos's estimation of time. He told the investigators that the strangulation did not happen quickly. He estimated it took approximately 30 minutes. This duration implies a gruesome persistence. It suggests that there were moments where he could have stopped, where the physical exertion could have broken his resolve, or where the reality of matricide could have pierced his anger. Instead, he persisted. He described readjusting his grip. He spoke of the physical reality of killing a human being with one's bare hands, noting the resilience of the human body. He admitted to using a wheelbarrow to move her body. He detailed how he loaded her into the family van. The level of premeditation in the aftermath was as stark as the violence of the act. He had driven to the scene, enlisted his friends, and staged the home, all while his mother lay dead. During the interrogation, when asked about his emotional state, Ramos offered no apologies. He displayed a lack of empathy that the detectives found profound. He spoke of the act as a necessity to end the argument, a solution to the problem of the bad grade and the subsequent parental discipline. But the confession was not just an admission of guilt, it was a roadmap. Ramos, now fully cooperative in the narration of his crime, agreed to lead investigators to where he had buried his mother. He was placed in a police vehicle, no longer a victim, but a prisoner. He directed the convoy to the River City Church on High Banks Road. The location was familiar to him. In the darkness of the previous night, he and his friends had brought Gail Cleavenger's body to a fire pit area on the church grounds. They had buried her beneath the ashes and soil, hoping the existing disturbance of the land would mask the fresh grave. Ramos guided the detectives to the precise spot. As the forensic team began the grim task of excavation, the reality of the investigation phase concluded, and the case transitioned into a recovery operation. The red flags, the scratches, the staged door, the behavior had all pointed to this tragic geographic coordinate. The breakdown of the friends had provided the leverage, but it was Ramos's own voice, steady and unrepentant, that filled in the horrific gaps of the timeline. The police response, initially treating the call as a property crime, had rapidly evolved through astute observation and psychological pressure. The lack of forced entry signs was the first thread pulled. The scratches on Ramos's face were the second. By the time the sun set on the day the body was found, the facade of the grieving son had been completely dismantled, revealing a 15-year-old capable of a 30-minute strangulation and a subsequent cover-up that chilled the veteran detectives to the bone. The sheer banality of the motive, a high school grade, contrasted violently with the brutality of the method, leaving the investigators with a solved case but an unsettling glimpse into a distinct void of human empathy. Ramos's statement that he refused to make excuses was already foreshadowed in that interrogation room. He didn't offer excuses because, in his mind, the logic of his actions required no defense. He had simply removed the obstacle. The investigation was closed, the burglars were in custody, and the body of Gail Cleavenger was finally recovered from the fire pit, ending the search but beginning the long legal procession toward sentencing. The transition from interrogation room admission to crime scene processing began in the dark early hours of Saturday morning. Gregory Ramos, having relinquished the location of his mother's body, accompanied detectives to the River City Church on High Banks Road. The site was familiar to the teenager, a location where he and his friends frequently gathered, now repurposed as a clandestine grave. The environment was quiet, starkly contrasting the chaotic activity that was about to commence. Detectives and crime scene technicians secured the perimeter, focusing their attention on a pre-existing fire pit behind the main structure. The area was circled by trees, secluded enough to hide the activities of 3 teenagers in the middle of the night, but not remote enough to prevent eventual discovery. Forensic investigators approached the fire pit with caution. The ground showed signs of recent disturbance. The earth churned and settled in a manner inconsistent with natural weathering. Ramos had detailed the burial with clinical precision during his confession, explaining how he and his friends, Dylan Keglerek and Brian Porras, had dug the hole. The recovery process was slow and methodical. Technicians used hand trowels and brushes to remove the soil layer by layer, to preserve any potential trace evidence transferred from the suspects to the gravesite. As the dirt was cleared, the grim reality of Ramos's statement materialized. Gail Cleavenger's body was found buried beneath the fire pit, just as her son had described. The recovery of the body provided the immediate, undeniable corroboration of the confession. The physical state of the remains matched the narrative of the strangulation. There were no gunshot wounds or stab marks that would have suggested the violent break-in Ramos had initially reported. Instead, the evidence on the body pointed to a prolonged struggle and asphyxiation, inconsistent with the 30 minutes Ramos claimed it took to end his mother's life. The proximity of the burial site to the family home, combined with the specific knowledge of the fire pit's location, erased any remaining possibility of a random transient attack. The soil found on the shovel and broom seized later would be compared to the soil composition at the church, locking the tools to the crime scene. Simultaneously, a separate investigative track focused on the items reported stolen. The burglary had been the cornerstone of Ramos's initial alibi. He had claimed to come home to find the house tossed and valuables missing, including electronics and a rifle. With the confession secured, the recovery of these items shifted from a theft investigation to the collection of staged evidence. Ramos implicated his friends, leading deputies to the residences of Ceglarek and Porras. The property was not in the hands of a fence or a pawnshop, nor was it scattered in a ditch. The missing PlayStation 4, the computer, and the rifle were recovered directly from the possession and hiding spots of the two accomplices. The retrieval of these items dismantled the staged crime scene at the Ramos residence. The front door had been kicked in, but the forensic analysis of the doorframe and the lack of other forced entry markers suggested the damage was inflicted to simulate a break-in, rather than to facilitate one. Finding the specific stolen goods with the exact individuals Ramos named proved that the removal of property was a calculated diversion, not a motive. The rifle, a particularly concerning item for law enforcement, was secured, removing a potential danger from the community and serving as a tangible link between the murder plot and the cover-up efforts. Digital forensics provided the connective tissue between the physical scenes. Investigators seized the mobile phones of Ramos, Ceglarek, and Porras. The extraction of data from these devices painted a picture of premeditation and panic that physical evidence alone could not convey. Text messages and call logs established a timeline that directly contradicted the 911 call. The digital footprint showed communication between the boys in the hours leading up to and immediately following the murder. There were no frantic attempts to reach Gail Cleavenger during the time Ramos claimed to be at school or out. Instead, the communications focused on the logistics of the disposal and the staging. The analysis of the phones revealed the orchestration of the cover-up. Messages exchanged between the teenagers discussed the plan, the timing, and the specific role each boy would play. The digital evidence corroborated the physical movements tracked by surveillance cameras in the area. Data points placed the devices at the Cleavenger home, then at the River City Church, and finally back at the respective homes of the accomplices. This electronic breadcrumb trail destroyed any potential defense that Ceglarek or Porras were unaware of the gravity of the situation, or that they were merely holding items for a friend without knowledge of the homicide. Furthermore, the examination of the family van used to transport the body yielded critical trace evidence. Although the boys had attempted to clean the vehicle, our forensic light sources and chemical reagents identified biological material consistent with the transportation of a human body. The wheelbarrow, which Ramos admitted to using to cart his mother from the house to the van, was analyzed for tire tread patterns that matched impressions left in the yard and near the loading point. Every physical object mentioned in the confession, the shovel, the van, the wheelbarrow, and the electronics, was located and forensically linked to the timeline Ramos had provided. The synthesis of this evidence created an airtight enclosure around the three teenagers. The body at the fire pit proved the death was a homicide and proved Ramos knew where she was. The electronics at the friends' houses proved the burglary was a lie. The digital logs proved the conspiracy. The autopsy results proved the method of death was exactly as Ramos had described in his chillingly flat admission. There were no gaps left for a defense attorney to exploit, no reasonable doubt to be found in the alignment of the physical world with the teenager's testimony. The investigation, which had begun with a chaotic 911 call about a burglary gone wrong, concluded with a comprehensive forensic map of a matricide, leaving the judicial system with the sole task of determining the penalty for a 15-year-old who refused to make excuses. With the physical and digital evidence forming an irrefutable timeline of the murder and the subsequent cover-up, the legal system moved swiftly to address the severity of the crime. Despite Gregory Ramos being only 15 years old at the time of the arrest, the calculated nature of the offense, specifically the 30-minute duration of the strangulation and the elaborate orchestration of the crime scene, compelled the state attorney's office in Volusia County to bypass the juvenile justice system entirely. Prosecutors argued that the sheer brutality required to extinguish the life of Gail Cleavenger, coupled with the cold rationality displayed in the aftermath, demonstrated a level of culpability that transcended age. Consequently, Ramos was charged as an adult with first-degree murder, abuse of a dead body, and tampering with evidence. His friends, Dylan Teglerek and Brian Porras, were also charged as adults with being accessories after the fact, though their cooperation with investigators placed them on a different legal trajectory. For over 2 years, the case wound its way through the pretrial motions and depositions common in capital murder proceedings. The defense faced an uphill battle. The confession was detailed, the forensic evidence was overwhelming, and the co-defendants were prepared to testify. In late 2020, facing the prospect of a mandatory life sentence without parole, or a lengthy sentence that would effectively amount to the same, Ramos and his legal team entered into negotiations with the prosecution. A plea agreement was reached to avoid the trauma and unpredictability of a jury trial. Ramos agreed to plead guilty to all charges. In exchange, the state agreed to a cap of 45 years in prison rather than seeking a life term, leaving the final determination of the exact sentence length to the presiding judge. The deal also stipulated that Ramos would serve the rest of his life on probation should he ever be released. The sentencing hearing took place in January 2021 inside a courtroom in DeLand, Florida. By this time, Ramos was 17 years old. The atmosphere was heavy. She charged not only with the gravity of a son being sentenced for killing his mother, but also with the visible fracture the murder had caused within the extended family. The gallery was divided, reflecting the complex grief that follows matricide. On one side stood the victim's siblings, who demanded the maximum punishment for what they viewed as an unforgivable act of evil. On the other stood Ramos's maternal grandmother, Gail's mother, who found herself in the impossible position of mourning her murdered daughter while terrified of losing her grandson to the prison system forever. The victim impact statements delivered that day were raw and devastating, illustrating the total destruction of the family unit. Gail Cleavenger's sisters addressed the court with palpable anger. They described the terror they now lived with, knowing their nephew was capable of such intimate violence. One aunt told the judge that the world was safer with Ramos behind bars, characterizing him as a sociopath who had manipulated everyone around him. They spoke of Gail not just as a mother, but as a sister and a daughter whose future had been stolen over a trivial dispute regarding school grades. Their testimony painted a picture of a woman who was dedicated to her son, making his betrayal all the more heinous. Conversely, the testimony of Gail's mother provided a stark, heartbreaking contrast. She approached the podium and spoke of her unconditional love for Gregory, stating that she believed Gail would not have wanted her son's life entirely wasted in a prison cell. She emphasized that he was still a child when the event occurred and that she would stand by him regardless of the judgment. This division highlighted the unique tragedy of the case. There was no external enemy to hate, only a family member who had turned on his own blood. When it was Gregory Ramos's turn to address the court, the room fell silent. Dressed in the orange jumpsuit of the Volusia County Jail, he stood before Circuit Judge James Clayton. He did not appear erratic or hysterical. Instead, he maintained the same calm, articulate demeanor that detectives had noted during his initial interrogation. He had prepared a statement, and as he began to speak, he acknowledged the irreversibility of his actions. He did not attempt to blame his friends, his upbringing, or the argument over the D grade that had sparked the violence. Ramos looked directly at the judge and the family members present. He admitted that he had taken away the one person who loved him most in the world. In a moment of clarity that seemed to belie his age, he declared, "I refuse to make excuses for myself." He stated that he was there to accept the penalty for his actions, acknowledging that no amount of time in prison could restore the life he had taken. And he told the court that he could only ask for forgiveness, even while understanding he did not deserve it. The statement was devoid of the teenage angst or deflection often seen in juvenile offenders. It was a cold acceptance of reality. He expressed specific remorse to his grandmother, acknowledging that he had caused her the greatest loss of all. Judge Clayton, having heard the plea, the impact statements, and the defendant's allocution, proceeded to render the sentence. The judge noted the chilling details of the case, specifically referencing the 30 minutes Ramos had spent strangling his mother. He remarked on the opportunity Ramos had during those 30 minutes to stop, to let go, and to call 911, but instead he had chosen to finish the act. The judge described the crime as cold and calculated, a disturbing deviation from normal human behavior. However, the judge also honored the terms of the plea agreement. Gregory Ramos was sentenced to 45 years in a Florida state prison for the charge of first-degree murder. For the charges of abuse of a dead body and tampering with evidence, he received concurrent sentences that would not extend his time behind bars beyond the murder sentence. However, the judge imposed a condition that ensured Ramos would remain under state supervision for the rest of his natural life. Upon his eventual release, he would serve lifetime probation, on a legal tether, ensuring that if he ever violated the law again, he could be returned to prison immediately. Because Ramos was a juvenile at the time of the offense, Florida law and Supreme Court precedents regarding juvenile life sentences applied, meaning his case would be eligible for a judicial review after he served 25 years. This provision offered a distant glimmer of hope for release in his 40s, provided he demonstrated genuine rehabilitation. As the hearing concluded, the bailiffs moved in. Ramos was fingerprinted in the courtroom, a final procedural stamp on his transition from a high school student with a future in architecture to a convicted murderer. His co-defendants, Cheglarek and Porras, faced their own reckonings shortly thereafter. Due to their cooperation and the fact that they did not participate in the actual killing, they were spared lengthy prison terms but did not escape consequence. They were sentenced to substantial periods of probation and credited for time served in jail, forever marked by their decision to help bury a body rather than report a crime. The legal chapter closed with Ramos being led out of the courtroom to begin his 45-year sentence, leaving behind a divided family and a community permanently scarred by the knowledge of what had transpired over a simple report card. On the legal resolution for Dylan Cheglarek and Brian Porras arrived with significantly less finality than that of their former friend. Both teenagers stood accused of being accessories after the fact to a capital felony, a charge carrying a potential penalty of up to 30 years in prison. However, the prosecution acknowledged that neither boy had participated in the actual murder, and their cooperation had been essential in recovering Gail Cleavenger's body from the fire pit at River City Church. In February 2021, the court handed down sentences that focused on supervision rather than incarceration. Both young men were adjudicated as adults but avoided state prison, instead receiving lengthy probation terms, 10 years for Cheglarek and a blend of juvenile detention and probation for Porras. Their futures remained technically open, yet permanently shadowed by the night. They agreed to help stage a burglary rather than call for help. For the Cleavenger family, the conclusion of the legal proceedings did not equate to peace. They were left to navigate a devastating duality, mourning a beloved mother and daughter while grappling with the reality that the killer was their own flesh and blood. In victim impact statements and media interviews, family members expressed a complex grief. They had lost Gail to violence, but they effectively lost Gregory to the prison system, a double bereavement caused by a singular act of rage. The grandmother, who had once celebrated Gregory's academic potential, was left with the memory of a grandson who viewed matricide as a logical solution to a disciplinary dispute. The community of DeBary was left to process how a mundane household stressor could devolve into such extreme violence. The crime shattered the suburban assumption of safety, now proving that lethal danger could originate from within a well-kept home just as easily as from the streets. The fire pit at the local church, once a benign gathering spot, became a grim landmark in local history, marking the shallow grave where a son discarded his mother to protect his grade point average. Ultimately, the legacy of the case rests on the chilling disproportion between the motive and the murder. The inciting incident was not years of abuse, financial desperation, or a psychotic break, but a D grade in an architecture class. Gregory Ramos admitted to calculating that eliminating his mother was preferable to facing her disappointment and the subsequent loss of privileges. He weighed a human life against a report card and chose the latter. This terrifying calculus stripped the crime of any emotional mitigation, leaving behind a stark narrative of a 15-year-old boy who strangled his mother for 30 minutes to avoid an argument, and then refused to make excuses for it.